everyone and welcome. I am back and I'm ready to do a demo for you showing you a underpainting in which I introduce color, and this is what we've been talking about. And in my last video I talked about making color blocks or color notes to help you choose the colors you're going to use and to test them out before you kind of jump into it. So what I decided is I'm going to do that same idea using the one color family but 4 values of the color, which I showed you in the last video. What I decided is, let me first show you the painting that I'm going to do. And it's just it's a very dreary scene. We're waiting for the sunset. But I'm going to take out my artistic license today, and I want to turn this into a sunnier, happier, blue sky day, okay? Which is a lot of fun to try to do. But in order to do that, I have to somehow set up the painting so it feels brighter and sunnier. So that means I want to choose a warmer color for my underpainting. So I went ahead and I selected 4 different pastels. They are the red, salmon red family. So I selected a dark red, a light red, and 2 values that fall in between. Okay, so these are the 4 colors that I'm going to use. You'll see, I can't. If I do that, they're going to fall out. So you'll see them when I put them up on the board. So the first thing, and you'll notice too that they are a variety of hard and soft. And typically, if I'm going to do a wet underpainting, and typically I like to use hard pastels for the wet underpaintings because they tend to get gummy if they're too soft. So I have to use a very light touch because I do have some soft ones here, but I want to show you that you can do it, but you have to have a light touch. So I'm going to get started. I've already made a very loose drawing with a pencil of my big simple shapes. I've got a tree shape, distant tree shape, I have the river bank, and then I have the river, and then the reflections. I'm going to alter reality a little bit, and I'm not copying the photo. I've shifted my trees over a little bit, but I'm using the photo just to kind of guide me as to the type of trees that I'm working with. So I'm going to start with the darkest dark. So I'm going to use the dark red and very lightly block in all of the darkest shapes. And the darkest shapes are going to be the upright planes. Now, one of the things that you can do, and I should have done, is, and so just bear with me while I locate it, is I like to first of all work from my thumbnail, my black and white thumbnail, rather than look at the photo. So I'm actually going to turn the photo over because that tends to get confusing. But if I look at the black and white thumbnail, it shows me where the values are. So anything upright, so the trees, the river bank, will be the darkest value. And I'm also going to put in the reflections at this point. I'm going to make them dark. They'll probably get lighter as the painting progresses, but I'm going to put them in the underpainting stage. And then I'm going to move on, looking at my thumbnail, to block in the lightest areas. And I'm going to use the light value red, which is a pink, to block in the lightest area, which happens to be the sky and the water. And I'm going to put the water in using horizontal strokes so that it will lay flat. And now I have to consider the middle value. So I have a dark middle and a light middle. I'm going to use the light middle value for the flat ground, or the grassy area, following along with my thumbnail. And I'm going to use the dark middle for those distant trees, those trees that are a little bit further back. I'm going to sneak a few back in here just for a little bit more interest. Now those are too far back so you wouldn't see them in the reflection, so I'm not going to put them down in the water. Alright, so this is my 4 value block in using one color, the red color family, and 4 values of that color. Now, I am working on UArt paper, so I have the option of doing a wet underpainting or a dry underpainting. And if I were to do a dry underpainting, I would use a piece of pipe insulation and rub everything in. And that gives me a nice, what I call a dry wash. But I've done that a lot in my videos here, my demos. So I think I'm going to do a, excuse my head there, I'm going to do a wet underpainting this time, and I'm going to use regular rubbing alcohol. I use 70% rubbing alcohol, a stiff bristle brush, and you don't need a lot of the alcohol because a little bit goes a long way, and I really don't want to get it too wet and drippy. So I'm going to start with the lightest color in my underpainting, which happens to be the sky, and using the alcohol and trying to control it so that it's not soupy but wet enough so that I'm liquefying the pastel. I'm going to just go ahead and paint. Now what I want to recommend is whenever you're doing any kind of wet underpainting and you're using a brush, I want you to treat this part of the painting as just as important as if you were painting with pastel. So if we spend enough time and do a good job with our underpainting, that's less pastel work that we end up having to do. So take your time on the underpainting. I always say don't be a house painter and just start at the top and work your way to the bottom. You are an artist with a brush, and try to paint as if you were painting with pastel. So that means if I'm going to paint water, I'm going to paint with horizontal strokes. I'm going to leave that reflection alone for the time being. Then I'm going to move on to the next value, which is the middle light value, and I'm going to liquefy this. And I'm going to talk to you in just a second about why would we choose a wet underpainting versus a dry underpainting. So start thinking about why you might do that. Now I'm going to move to the next value, which is the middle dark value. So that's these distant trees. Now it's starting to drip slightly, but actually I don't mind the drips. I always say embrace the drips, because it's those drips that form those really interesting happy accidents that make doing a wet underpainting worthwhile. And now finally I'll move on to the darkest value, which is the tree. I'm going to go ahead and kind of paint in some tree trunks, just because I want to start setting that up for the feeling of foliage. I'm just wetting this, all the dark areas, and I really don't mind if it drips here, because it just adds to things. And now I'm going to go and paint the reflections, but notice what I'm going to do. I'm going to paint the reflections with vertical strokes, up and down strokes, and I really do want this to drip, so I'm going to be a little bit more liberal with my alcohol so that I can get those drips happening, because the idea is I want this to start looking watery even before I add the pastel. Same with the bank. And we're just going to let that drip. Now the interesting thing when you use the alcohol is that as it dries and the alcohol evaporates, you get more interesting things happening to the pastel. Because you're liquefying the pastel with the alcohol, and it's turning it back into its original state, which was a liquid. And so interesting things happen as it absorbs and interacts with the pigment. So we have to let that dry for just a minute. Alcohol will dry faster than water, but still it has, depending on where you live, a little bit of a drying time. Normally what I do while I'm waiting for the underpainting to dry is to select my pastel palette. I'm going to do my very best to hold it up so that they don't fall. And what I do is I look at my photo. Now I can actually look at my photo, and I say to myself, what colors would I use for the dark areas? And I choose a selection of darks. What areas would I use for my light areas, which is the sky and the water? So I choose a selection for that, and I put them in piles. What colors would I use for the trees? So I choose a selection of greens from dark to light, and they're kind of mixed in, warm and cool, but I try to get a variety of dark, light, warm, cool, and neutral in my green area. Excuse me. What colors would I use for the distant trees? So I pick some grayed down blues and violets for the trees that are in the distance. And what color will I use for the grasses? So I've selected some yellows and oranges and peachy colors for the grasses. Once I have those selected, now when I go to paint, I don't have to stop my train of thought to go find colors because they're all right here in front of me. So taking that extra step, oh, excuse me, of picking your colors in advance really is helpful, and I really encourage you to do it. Excuse me. Now let's see if it's dry. It's almost dry, so I'm going to give it another minute. So I'm going to share with you another visual. This I call Underpainting Choices. Now, as we delve into the world of color, we're going to find that there are different ways we can achieve color. And we can use different mediums and get different effects. This is an example of underpaintings of the same subject but using different mediums. So here's a watercolor. Here's gouache. Here's the dry wash where I just used the piece of foam. This is an alcohol wash, and you can see how interesting. Can I move closer? Can you see it? Interesting the drips are when the alcohol evaporated from this particular underpainting. So as it dries, interesting things start happening. All right, it's getting closer to being dry, so I think we're good to go at this point. And the first thing I do when I approach a wet underpainting, after I make sure it's dry, is to ask myself, is there anything about this underpainting, like happy accidents or something that has happened, that I might want to preserve, I might want to keep? And a lot of times I look and I see that maybe some of the drips kind of look like tree trunks. So I say to myself, you want to try to retain some of that, so don't be so quick to cover everything up. And one thing that I like to do is work to slowly bring the painting together instead of jumping right in and making drastic changes. So the first thing that I'm going to do is reinforce all the dark areas. And I'll put my glasses on so I can see. So I'm going to go ahead and in where all the dark areas are, which are the trees, I'm going to very lightly layer a dark value pastel. But I do want some of this red to peek through, because after all, I selected it because I liked the fact that it was hopefully going to give a sunny feeling to my painting. So I don't want to cover it all up too quickly. Now, if I put a color above the water, I'm going to put it below the water in the reflection. And I'm going to make my strokes in the water vertical, up and down. In other words, I'm not going to paint another tree in the water. I want to have up and down vertical strokes. I'm going to choose a second dark. That was a dark purple. This is another dark purple. I'm going to see, maybe probably layer 3 or 4 layers of dark. I forgot to put in the bank, so I'm going to put that in, but I don't want it to be one long continuous line or it'll look like a worm shape, so I'm breaking up that line slightly. And above the water, it's going in the water. Let's choose yet another dark. This time I'm choosing a dark red, not the same red that I already used though, a different, more of a rusty red. Above the water. Oops, this little guy needs a reflection, doesn't he? In the water. And let's go with another layer of dark. Let's go with a dark blue. So we got a dark blue, very lightly. I try to remind myself the right touch is a light touch. If you do a light touch, you're able to get more layers than if you press down too heavy. How do I know it's a light enough touch? I can still see the underpainting. That means I've not covered it all up. Now I'm going to go with the local color of this tree, which happens to be green. So I didn't use green right away because I want interesting color in my darks. Above the water, I'm going to put it down in the water. Now let's see. I have to decide where I want the light source because that's what's going to tell me where I'm going to have light and dark on all of the landscape. So let's just say that we're going to have the light, since it was a cloudy day, I can decide where the light's going to be. So I'm going to put the sun up in the left-hand corner to remind me that that's where the light is coming from. So that means I can use a warmer dark green on the left side of these trees. Above the water, then I'm going to put it in the water. And I think what I'm going to do, now I'm all blocked in with the dark, and I know that took a while, but it is going to ultimately result in more interesting dark areas. Alright, so now I'm going to do the distant trees, then I'm going to do the sky, and then I'm going to do the bank, and then I'll finally do the water. So the distant trees, let's talk about them. The trees that are in the distance are kind of in a haze, a little bit of a haze, so we're not seeing them clearly, so they're a little bit fuzzier, but they're also cooler because they're in the distance. So I'm using some grayed down blues and violets for these distant trees. I'm going to use that color to start carving into the trees so that I have more interesting tree shapes. Let's make it even lighter. I'm going to choose it, well, that's not too much different. I want it to go a little bit lighter. So I picked another pale gray blue. An interesting thing has happened to my surface. Because of the alcohol wash underpainting on this board, which I had mounted, it became rough. So I'm getting texture. Now if I didn't want texture, I could rub it in and build, and I would get rid of the texture. But I like the texture because it allows the underpainting to peek through. So you can see that salmon color peeking through the blue, and it actually gives a little bit of color harmony to everything. I'm going to do the sky, but before I do that, I want to put in some tree trunks here, and that's just so I don't forget to put in tree trunks. Sometimes you think of something and you got to tend to it, otherwise you forget. And I'm going to put, they are reflected in the water a little bit, so I'm going to put them, pull them down in the water. Right now I can move on. I'm going to move on and put in the sky. Now, in my photo, the sky was very dark, dreary, overcast, but I want to make this a sunny day, so I'm going to use some brighter, more intense, clear blues. That blue that I just put on is a little bit too dark, so it almost looks like twilight. But I'd rather put it in too dark and then modify it with lighter blues so that I have that dark underneath. So now I'm starting to modify it and making it a little bit lighter. Now you know we spent the month of, was it June? On painting the sky. So if you're new to the page and you didn't get a chance to go back for the month of June, and everything was devoted to painting the sky. And you can kind of get caught up that way. So I'm using the sky color to break up my tree shape to make it a little bit more of an interesting silhouette. And I want to make the horizon have a little bit of a warm yellow glow. So I'm using a pale warm yellow at the horizon just to give a feeling of light at the horizon there. And I think that's going to be good for right now. So we've got our sky, our distant trees, our foreground trees, and the start of the reflection. So what we're going to work on now is to paint the grassy area and work more on the tree. So before I get to the grassy area, let's address the tree shapes a little bit more. And I want to just share with you, because I know I've been asked this a lot, is when are we going to be working on trees? and it's going to be in the fall, probably October. Still working on my schedule, but we will definitely be spending an entire month on trees. So if you are a tree lover and you want to paint trees and you want more information on painting trees, we're gonna get there. What I'm doing now is just working with the greens that I already selected so that I can get a variety of greens in my tree shape. And I'm reminding myself that I don't want to cover up the entire underpainting, but I also am reminding myself that if I put a color in the water, in the trees, I need to pull it down into the water. It's really easy to forget to do that. Alright, I'm going to add the light on the trees in just a minute, but I put it above the water, I'm going to pull it down in the water. Alright, now let's work on the ground cover. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take those salmon-y colors that were in the underpainting and I'm going to paint in some dirt. Now, those of you who've seen my demos and followed me know that I like to have dirt. If it's green, if it's growing, I like to put in some dirt colors, and that just helps. When I put the green stuff on top, it helps it become a little bit more interesting. So I'm putting in some pinks, peaches, rusts, so that I can have more interesting ground cover, if you will. And basically all I'm doing is I'm going with the colors that I've already pulled out. They're just picking them up on my tray. I know that they're going to work for ground cover. I'm going to address one thing that I'm noticing is starting to happen, and I'm starting to lose my bank, okay? You see the bank has disappeared, so I'm going back to reinforce the dark area to reestablish the bank where the water comes and hits the trees. Alright. And while I have that, and by the way, this is a Terry Ludwig eggplant, super dark pastel. While it's in my hand, I'm going to reinforce some of the tree trunks that are in my main tree. Okay, so now we have dirt. So now it's time to put in the grass. I'm going to start in the distant grassy area and go over the dirt with a very light kind of neutral, kind of a yellowy green, but more of a neutral. And I'm going to be putting a picture of my palette up with the demo, and you'll be able to have a closer look at the actual pastels that I've used for the painting. So I know sometimes when you're watching the video, you can't always see exactly what's in my hand, so you'll be able to kind of look at the photo to get a better idea. And now I started in the back and I'm working my way forward, but as I get closer to the foreground, I'm going to introduce more of a, what we would consider a grass green, and I'm using more up and down strokes because I can now I can actually see the front of the grasses. The grasses in the distance, I used horizontal marks. All right, so now we've got some grass. It's a little bit spotty. Let me go ahead and kind of pull those colors together. So now we have our grassy area. The next thing we have to do is finish the trees and do the water. I'm going to go ahead and push a little bit harder with some of this distant blue color, because what I'm finding is, because of the underpainting color peeking through, that you can't really see the color very well. So I am doing what I would consider a shouting mark and pushing a lot harder so that you can start to see the shapes of the foreground trees a little bit more clearly. I also need to come back and reinforce the bank. I started to lose it again, and that does happen. So you always have to kind of keep on top of it, and I don't want it to be a solid line that becomes kind of snake-like and worm-like, and we don't want that. All right, I'm going to do one thing to the trees, and I'm going to spray it with a little bit of workable fixative. Probably sprayed a little bit too much, but that's really okay. It's got to wait for it to dry. While it's drying, I'm going to clean my pinky finger, which is my brush, and I'm going to use it to smooth out the sky just a little bit. I think it had just a little bit too much texture, and it's fighting with the busyness of the stuff in the foreground. So I'm using my finger, and I'm using what I call butterfly fingers just to smooth the sky a little bit. And now, oops, that's the wrong yellow. Yellow can make a difference. If you use too much of a lemony yellow in the sky, it just doesn't look as nice as if you use a warmer kind of orangey yellow. All right, that's just about dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of the warmer, lighter greens and put them in the areas that I feel would be getting the sunlight. So I don't want to put it everywhere, otherwise the tree will look flat. I'm only putting it where I think foliage is sticking out and getting some sunlight. Now if I use it up in the tree, I'm going to pull it down in the water. So if I use it in the tree, it goes down in the water. All right, let's see. Let's get the darker green back in here. I think I can kick it up another notch and make it a little bit lighter and brighter. So I'm going to introduce some of this grassy green up into the tree just a little bit. Very lightly. The right touch is a light touch. And if I use a light enough touch, then it looks more like foliage. If I press down too hard, then I cover up the underpainting and I cover up all the texture. So try to be mindful of the pressure that you are using. All right. What I want to show you now is how I create the reflections and paint the water. So I'm going to once again clean my pinky finger, and I'm going to take my finger and drag it. It's okay. This is an important demo. I'm being informed that I'm going a little bit longer than I usually do, but I really wanted to show you how to do the reflections. It's really important. So what I did was I pulled those down. You can see now they're already looking wet and watery. So the vertical strokes, pull it and actually blend it, which I don't usually like to do. Now I'm going to take the color of the water and use horizontal strokes and drag those horizontal strokes across the reflection using the same colors that I used up in the water. So I'll press down a little bit harder where there's just water, and where it comes across the reflection, I'm going to just drag it across ever so slightly. Sometimes I've got to go back and pull down the reflections and then reintroduce some water. So there's a lot of give and take with how I do the water. And the final thing that I like to do is add just a little hint of a current line up along the bank and maybe down in the water with the lighter value green. So again, I've got to sometimes come back and reintroduce the trees and then come back with the water. So it's kind of a multi-step process. All right, I'm going to stop at this point because I think you get the idea of the wet underpainting, letting some of it peek through to harmonize the entire painting. The warm color creates a sunnier, happier mood, and then I showed you a little bit more about reflections, which we'll get in more detail when we study water. But I think that's enough for today. I will do some finishing touches and share the finished painting directions, sorry. I get caught up in the painting here, and I'm going to finish up and I will post it, and I hope you've enjoyed this video and hope you found it helpful.